the Washington State Autonomous Vehicle Work Group Executive Committee meeting. Today is September 23rd, 2020. It is 9:30 a.m. and I believe we have a quorum to conduct business. My name is Jim Restucci. I'm a commissioner for Washington State Transportation Commission representing Yakima County, and I am your interim chair. I believe first person we have up, Ara Swanson, are you going to do anything with introductions?
Jim, this is Catherine. I will do the overview of the virtual meeting operations, but we could do a roll call first if you want.
That'd be great. Let's go ahead and do a roll call.
Great. So I'll do a roll call of who I was able to get from the list of panelists, but I know folks are joining as I'm saying this. So if I miss anyone, please chime in at the end. So we have Senator Joe Nguyen, Senator Ann Rivers, Representative Kloba, Representative Banky, Johnny Alexander for John Baptiste, Jack Lovell for Mike Kreidler, Teresa Bernstein, Roger Millar, Pam Cook, Justin Layton. We have Todd O'Brien, Jessica Ramirez, or I'm sorry, Todd O'Brien is what that was, who it was. Brian Mistel, John Milbrath, Bryce Yadden, Annabelle Chang, Steve Gordon, and Anna Zebarts. Is there anyone that I missed? Feel free to chime in.
Yes, Kurt Augustine.
Great, thanks, Kurt.
Caleb Weaver.
And Tom Alberg.
Yin Hawang.
This is Ariel Wolf.
Great. So I think that wraps up our roll call, Jim, and we can head into our overview of virtual meeting operations.
Thank you, please do. And if you joined the meeting and you didn't get called, please let us know in the chat box and we will go ahead and make sure that you are counted as present. Thank you.
For sure. So I know a lot of you are familiar with Zoom at this point, so I will keep this overview short and sweet. Just a quick reminder for those on the executive committee on this Zoom webinar, you are a panelist, and so you have the ability to mute and unmute yourself. So that should hopefully be a little bit easier than in previous meetings. Please stay on mute unless you're speaking, just to cut down on background noise. And then you're encouraged to turn on your video just to make it a little bit more interactive, especially as we're doing discussion. You can use the chat box to communicate with panelists, meeting hosts, committee members, and presenters. You do have the ability to also send a chat to everyone on the line, but we wouldn't necessarily suggest that you use this feature. So just know that if you have a question, probably to panelists is your best option. All right. During discussion and Q&A periods, because you don't have the raise your hand function that you might have seen in other Zoom meetings, we'll just note to either physically raise your hand and Jim will see it on a video, or to pose your question in the chat box. We would love the interactiveness of folks actually asking questions. So the more that folks can ask their questions, the better. Also, just a quick note that you will be able to see the questions in the Q&A box from the attendees, but you probably won't be able to pose a question in that Q&A box. However, you can do it through the chat. Next slide. For the attendees on the call, you're muted right now with no video capabilities, and you can use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted. You can also use the Q&A box to pose questions, and organizers will read the questions aloud during the Q&A period of each presentation, and then if you have your hand raised, we can unmute you to ask questions. For call-in participants, you can still access the Q&A box if you're viewing the presentation online. If you're only calling in right now, you can mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6. And for those who are only calling in, you can also raise your hand by pressing *9. And I think that should be about it. I guess the only thing I would just add is that if you have any questions, any technical difficulties, please feel free to use the chat for the executive committee and the Q&A for the attendees, and we're happy to help. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Catherine. Next, we'll hear from Scott Shogan on AVs in the COVID-19 era. Scott, are you ready?
I am ready. Good morning, everybody. So I know that this is a hot topic. We kind of teased it out earlier in the summer. And clearly, as with all things COVID related, we're still very much trying to understand kind of the impact, both near term and long term, on COVID on a lot of things. And this is, certainly a significant area of that. So, so we wanted to start by talking through the immediate impacts that we're seeing on AV developments by COVID. And clearly one of the biggest ones, we saw a suspension of most of the testing and most passenger carrying services in March, with most of the rest of the country shutting various things down. A lot of that testing has resumed. Passenger carrying testing has not really resumed much to date, at least not in any publicized fashion. But what we did see is some services really repurposing passenger carrying vehicles to look at different use cases, delivery use cases. And this was an example. Cruise used some of their vehicles back in the spring to do some food delivery to different food pantry type locations, really just to give another use case, a benefit of operating the vehicles besides purely the testing. So we saw some of that reuse of vehicles in that way. But significantly, we also saw an advancement of delivery-based AV vehicles that are different types of form factors as well. So not just passenger carrying vehicles, but looking at other types of vehicles and how they could to help address some of the needs from COVID. So one example of that that was kind of prominently publicized was at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. There was the Jacksonville Transit Authority repurposed an AV shuttle that was in the region to do delivery runs, essentially connecting the hospital to an off-site drive-through test facility for COVID. So again, we kind of saw a repurposing of a vehicle, of a passenger carrying vehicle on a half-mile route, completing that type of support function to connect up the hospital with that test site in a productive fashion. We also saw increases in testing in contactless delivery. So obviously, I think we all recognize one of the key winners, if you will, of COVID was e-commerce. We saw this huge jump in e-commerce. So with that, we saw this jump in vehicles that really support that. And this vehicle is a vehicle from Neuro. It is a street running vehicle, but does not have a passenger carrying capacity. And this vehicle was used to do deliveries for Kroger, the supermarket chain, for CVS as well in Houston, as part of their kind of testing regime during this COVID time. We also saw smaller form factors looking at sidewalk running vehicles. This is a vehicle from KiwiBot as an example that is doing food deliveries in San Jose. This is still a semi-autonomous vehicle. There's a certain level of human control in this, but again, we're seeing kind of advancement of different types of delivery vehicles, and specifically in this case, avoiding human-to-human interaction, looking at how these vehicles could help fill that gap during this time. And then finally, long-haul freight. So we saw continued development in this arena. This is an example of Too Simple. Too Simple's running about 40 vehicles around the country and doing active revenue-generating service for UPS at this time. And that was continued essentially 24/7 through the pandemic of fulfilling that type of service. So that was an area that clearly saw kind of continued development through the kind of the quarantine, the heart of quarantine periods, if you will. So that's really what we kind of saw unfold over the last several months, and some of the use cases that are developing. Much more speculative is the long-term impacts of COVID in general, and how they are going to change AVs and mobility in general, what those trend lines look like today. So certainly we're starting to get some empirical information on those trend lines, but how likely are they to stick is a big question. And then the secondary question too is just simply the economic damage done by COVID. How does that impact the development process here? So a big area of speculation is really the long-term impact, of travel demand and on modality. So how are uses of different modes changing? So kind of on one side of that equation, we see, potential long-term and permanent decrease in commuter traffic. And I think that's, one area of significant speculation, that the work from home shift has likely to have staying power, at least in part. And may fundamentally change kind of commuter patterns going forward. We also saw a marked decrease in transit and in shared mobility desirability. Part of that certainly was overall drop in volume, but clearly there's a factor of the human-to-human interaction that's inherent to transit and shared mobility, and questions as the pandemic abates, how much will that continue to be a factor? On the opposite side of the equation, we see, clearly trends towards more SOV traffic. So from a sheer traffic volume standpoint, we see that as a trend. Many would say, a negative one if it continues. And then certainly additionally, on the e-commerce side, I'm sure those of you working from home, all you need to do is see how many times times a day the Amazon truck drives by. The huge increase in e-commerce is also driving additional volumes on the roadways. So jury very much out in terms of the overall impact on traffic, on congestion, and the long-term shifts on this. But these are some of the trends, at least, that we're seeing today. There's also big questions on, is there a long-term impact to urbanization? Do we see, because of decreased need to live near work, if we see more and more remote working, do people make different choices based on their ability to get more space, based on their ability to reduce their costs in terms of where they live? Certainly, this is just a data point in time, and the jury is very much out in terms of how this plays out long term. But over this summer, in New York City, as an example, saw a very significant shift in terms of their real estate market, in terms of huge increases in listings from people looking to sell and in significant part probably leave the city, while the prices were down, the contracts were down. So there was very much a shift in New York where we saw that short-term impact. Whether that's a lasting impact certainly is another story at this point. So another factor to this is changes in technology acceptance. So, had the pandemic not happened, we would all be sitting around a table at the Seattle airport. And instead, we've all learned to navigate Zoom and many other technology platforms. Do we see an increase in technology acceptance in such a way that really creates a shift towards willingness to accept automated vehicles down the line? very little empirical data about this right now, but just kind of one data point from a developer that did their own surveying on this and saw a noticeable increase in acceptance of or willingness to try AVs as a part of this. So somewhat a mental shift potential in terms of consumer willingness to try AV technology. And the economic damage that I mentioned, so this is a big factor that has not been talked about as much, frankly. And clearly the economic impacts overall of COVID on the company's bottom lines, the trend lines potentially in terms of if we see decrease in vehicle travel and commuting patterns, do we see decreases in vehicle purchasing along the lines. This was a survey done, an audience survey done as part of an Autonomous Vehicles Online event that found a significant number of attendees on that saw that there was going to be delay in development of level 3 technology, that the financial instability was going to cause some AV plans to be shelved. So,
Scott, we're
again,
getting
jury's still out. We have not seen
Scott,
dramatic shifts in this.
we're
sorry.
getting comments that we're not hearing you. You're not hearing you loud enough.
Oh, I apologize. Let me try to get a little closer to the mic here. Is that Jim? Are you able to hear that better, or anybody?
I can hear you better. I had to turn up my volume to hear you, so
Okay.
it's definitely coming in lower than everybody else.
Okay, I apologize for that. I'll try this, and please chime in if I'm still not getting the volume through, and I'll shift to a headset. So, anyways, again, just summarizing here that that people in the industry significantly expected some delays in the development of level 3 technology or level 3 and above technology based on some of the financial instability caused by COVID. So, so certainly we expect to see some impacts there. So on finishing on a positive note with this, I did want to note one of the other challenges certainly coming out of this is changes in revenue and reduction potential in revenue for the public sector in providing funding for roadways. And this was a notable announcement last month in Michigan, where a startup company called Cavnu launched an initiative with Michigan DOT that's looking at a public-private partnership model for dedicating lanes for AV use and developing out different AV use cases, different types of
computer audio
of vehicle typologies to be able to actually generate revenue for that infrastructure. So we see there being an opportunity with this as well, that clearly we're seeing private sector investment that sees a future in this, both in the AV development and in potential to work collaboratively with infrastructure owner operators and potentially create some revenue generating opportunities out of this as well. So with that, just some takeaways here. I think clearly delivery use cases are more likely to be here to stay. So, these are use cases that were already in development. They're not dependent on COVID, but clearly this accelerated their development, and the increases in e-commerce, which are also likely here to stay, are likely going to continue to drive those models. So there's certainly an opportunity for this group to put some increased policy focus on delivery use cases and those different types of vehicles as well. Long-term impacts, really too early to tell. There's no empirical data here, but the anecdotal data certainly does suggest that we could see some delays on AV service launches. A lot of the models for AV development are dependent on launching passenger carrying services, and those are likely to have some amount of impact in terms of delay, both from an R&D funding standpoint, but also simply from concerns on multiple passengers of vehicles, cleaning vehicles between passengers, kind of all of those logistical challenges as well. Uncertain impact on the longer term fundamentals here, clearly, and that's what, you know, we're all waiting to kind of understand how that plays out, and likely to see some of those trend lines today break over time, but you know, but clearly it's going to be something that we're all going to have to watch and kind of understand as time passes here on how some of those long-term fundamentals may change some of the business models for developing AV technology. So with that, I will pause for a minute, Jim, and open it up if we want to have any questions on this topic before I move on.
Scott, we do have a question from an anonymous attendee. It says, do you think it makes sense to provide dedicated lanes to a technology that doesn't exist yet when cyclists and pedestrians are dying in increasing numbers and still do not have a contiguous network or safe, protected infrastructure?
Well, that's obviously a really big picture question, big policy question. You know, I think that it is, you know, I know in the Michigan example, I'll just simply cite that the idea there is really looking at somewhat narrowly, with a narrow corridor focus, looking at that as a way to incubate AV technology deployment as it's, you know, becoming increasingly apparent that there may be a requirement for some dedicated lane type of infrastructure to do that. Now, you know, passing judgment on the priorities between, you know, non-motorized users and all of that, you know, space allocation, you know, I certainly can't comment on that as those two intertwine, but I think that it's, you know, as you look broadly at this, it's, you know, is it too early or not the right focus? In most places, probably, but I think this is, you know, something that looking narrowly at where this technology is going to be developed and how to accelerate deployment to get other benefits out of that. You know, it's an interesting concept that you know, that clearly many are buying into.
Thank you, Scott. Other questions for Scott?
This is Tom Alberg. I might respond to that question too. It does seem to me that, you know, introducing particularly trucking to interstate highways, autonomous trucking, I mean, I do think, you know, that's already occurring in the Southwest, and I think we're going to see it in several places. It doesn't mean that you have autonomous truck from, you know, where it picks up goods and takes it and delivers them to a warehouse. But certainly once the trucks get on the interstate, I think there's going to be growing evidence that it's safer to put it into an autonomous mode than a non-autonomous mode. And going to have to figure out how you get it, you know, is there a driver in there? Do you remotely control it when it gets off the freeway? But it doesn't necessarily require autonomous lanes. And I think, you know, the real need is for some experimentation. And that seems to be occurring, for example, in the Arizona and Texas.
Thank you, Tom. Just for administrative purposes, if you have the capability to use your video, we would appreciate it if you turn it on when you're asking your question so that we can have a little bit more interactivity between the members today. So other questions or comments?
Okay. Well, let's move on then. Appreciate your attention on that topic. And another area that we wanted to cover here up front was, again, recapping from our meeting back in June, talk a little bit more about the polling exercise that we went through that was really helpful to our team and I think to the subcommittees to really get centered around what are some of the priorities. How do we move forward as a group for the duration? So there were some overarching questions posed to the executive committee. Really, what should the focus of the work group be through the sunset date? very broadly. And what role are the cooperative automated transportation policy goals, what role do they play in guiding that direction? Those were really the big picture questions that we kind of put forth to this group. And the proposal that was put forward was to use those CAT policy goals as a framework for action. And we went through that polling exercise, kind of building on those policy goals as well. So again, just a quick recap on the CAT policy goals that were advanced from the Infrastructure and Systems Subcommittee and accepted from there. So number one, organizing for innovation, goal around shared mobility, economic vitality and livability, infrastructure and context-sensitive street design, land use, equity, safety, and environment. So those were the 8 CAT policy goals that were adopted. So we took these goals and embedded them into some questions, and want to walk through what that process looked like and the results again, and talk about what we then carried forward from those results in terms of action items. So the first part of this exercise was rank order of priority. So essentially, we put up some questions or some focus areas, asked each of you to rank them in order of priority from your perspective, and there were broad focus, the broad work group focus areas of near-term testing and near-term testing activities, deployment-oriented activities, and CAT policy-oriented activities. We asked you first to rank those and then dove into subtopics within each of those. And then we also asked for some free-form questions and allowed for actually written responses that helped us kind of inform the priorities there as well. So just going through kind of the summary of these results, we kind of showed these to you in real time. But the first question was these broad work group focus areas. So again, focusing on near-term testing, focusing on the needs of deployment long-term, and focusing on the CAT policy goals and achieving some of those objectives that were developed. And we really saw no strong preference here. They were all very evenly ranked coming out of this question. So so that was interesting in understanding kind of that balance that the executive committee prefers here in approaching this this topic. So we then dove further into some sub-questions related to each of these, and we started with near-term testing activities and asked questions regarding this. And there was some clearer preferences that came out in some of these activities. So and in this one in particular, ongoing discussions with companies to really understand what's driving their testing decisions, what they need to be able to test in Washington, and understanding kind of the roles of all of the different subcommittees in terms of what needs to happen to push some of those objectives forward. That really came out as kind of a clear first place finisher here amongst these actions. With other activities here identified as well, still on the list, but we use this really to set priorities, not to exclude any activities coming out of this. Shifting on to deployment-oriented activities. So again, we did see some priorities coming out of this as well. The kind of top priorities include developing an understanding of infrastructure investments to pursue where there may be infrastructure needs to really allow AVs to advance, prioritizing topics for legislative reform, identifying and adopting AV guiding principles as part of this. So we definitely saw some preferences kind of rise to the top on this question as well. And the fourth question is the CAT-oriented activities. So essentially activities meant to help achieve some of the CAT policy goals. And what rose to the top here was conducting scenario planning. So I think essentially looking at what are the different scenarios in terms of how introduction of AVs could play out, and what are some of the good and bad implications of those, and some of the potential policy tools to address those implications. That's really at its heart what scenario planning would address, and that was what really rose to the top here. Again, many other activities that certainly still registered some preference across group members in terms of focusing on health and equity, focusing on prioritizing some policy goals to enable some near-term use cases, engaging disadvantaged opportunities, all of these important, again, really using this to kind of establish preferences or priorities. So where we went with each of these, we took this information back and developed a matrix effectively that looked at each of these areas, kind of included in the priority that this committee assigned, and looked at the roles of each of the subcommittees in helping to achieve that. So for most of these activities, we identified who we thought was the lead subcommittee that was most appropriate to kind of champion the initiative. But then we identified for each of the subcommittees, do you have a role in this? What does that role look like? What are some of the activities that you need to focus on to help achieve outcomes related to that action? So the intent of this was not to be prescriptive. It was not a mandate or a dictate, but simply to provide some context to each of the subcommittees to say, this is what we interpreted coming out of the executive committee. How can you play a role in advancing this? Where do you feel like you can have the most impact on advancing some of these objectives? So it really was meant as a discussion starter, something that the subcommittees could then look at and say, what do we feel most equipped to handle? How do we handle, how do we address kind of the prioritization from the executive committee and what we're already doing, and really kind of establishing those priorities and those work activities going forward. So that's been distributed and shared with the subcommittees at this point. And really, as subcommittee activities continue, looking to use that to kind of frame out action and be able to track progress towards the priorities that did come out of this this activity and this polling exercise. So I believe that's all we have here. So let me again stop there, Jim, if we want to entertain any questions.
Questions or comments for Scott on this item? We really need some input from the committee here on this direction. So if we could get discussion going, that would be wonderful. Okay, well, I guess there's no questions in regards to this item. We are early. Do you want to move on to the next agenda item, or do we have anything that we want to discuss?
I think nothing else from my perspective, Jim. I don't know, Rima, any other activities we need to share here, more general updates before we move on?
No, I just, want to make sure everybody's on the committee is clear that basically what Scott just covered is what has been communicated to the subcommittees, is suggestive direction. We're not trying to dictate their work direction, but given your input, we wanted to make sure all of this sounded good, and it sounds like with no comments that you all feel comfortable with it. I think it's important that the subcommittees understand that we have vetted this with you, because we did have some questions about some of the areas of focus. So I just want to make sure everybody understands we have shared this with the subcommittees, and some of them are already rolling it forward.
Thank you, Rima. Okay. Other questions, comments for Scott? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Next item, thank you, Scott. The next item on the agenda
So
is,
we've actually got a hand raised from Representative Kloba.
oh, Representative Kloba, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I just had a quick kind of a comment and a request. So I really like the way that you guys have translated those priorities into where's the most likely place for them to land, and what group is you're suggesting what group is the best, and so that way we can keep track of the priorities. I really appreciate that approach. But my request is, I think because I'm not sure how many of us on the executive committee are like me, and I don't necessarily connect with any of the subcommittees on a regular basis. I haven't seen that document, and so if that's possible to share that with us afterwards, that'd be much appreciated.
Rima, can we take care of that?
Yeah, it was sent out quite a while ago. Scott, remind me, I think it was in July. So it's probably buried,
well, okay.
buried in your
I will go back and look for it.
No, I appreciate you letting us know. I'm more than happy to resend that again. It's a great little matrix, and that you'll probably enjoy looking. It's quite detailed, but I will push that out to everybody again, and you guys can refresh yourselves on it.
Okay, sorry. It seems to have gotten buried in my overly full mailbox.
Understandable.
Thanks.
Completely understandable. Other questions or comments? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on.
Okay. Thank you.
Next item is the AB subcommittee updates. We have two subcommittees that are in need of input from the executive committee. First, we'll hear from Dr. Andrew Dannenberg, co-chair of the Health and Equity Subcommittee. Dr. Dannenberg, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
You have the floor, sir.
Okay, can you bring up the slides? Do you have the slides there, or do I need to share a screen?
Let me check with our staff here. Do we have the slides for Dr.?
So we did plan on Dr. Dannenberg sharing the slides yourself, if that's possible.
Oh, okay, because I thought the first one showed up at the end of the last set, which would mean they were right in front of you, but I can, okay, let me share a screen then. It's going to take me a second to get the right place. Okay.
Because each of these have been discussed by us as we go through them, and there is not just the usual, hey, we need to tell it better.
Okay, so can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm the chair of the Health and Equity Subcommittee for this working group. And what we wanted to do today was give you an update on some of the work that we've been doing, and in particular give two proposals that we have, which are in draft, for which we would like your input, as well as input from other subcommittees to see if they can move forward. I'll give just a very brief background on who our subcommittee is and why we're here. We were created in July 2019 to look at the health and equity issues of automated mobility, for looking at equitable distribution and to see that the negative impacts are not disproportionately borne by traditionally marginalized communities. We've been meeting roughly monthly, primarily by Microsoft Teams, with work group meetings. We tend to have, I'd say, 15 to 20 members, many of whom, or most of whom, have been fairly regular members of the group, with a reasonable distribution of persons attending the committees, but underrepresentation from the marginalized communities whose issues we are focused on. And so that is what one of the proposals is about. I want to remind you, and I'm coming from the public health world. I'm a physician. I've worked in public health for a long time. I was at the Centers for Disease Control before moving out here to Seattle, where I'm on the faculty at the School of Public Health at University of Washington. I want to remind you that health is not health care, and this is kind of a common misperception. And if you look at what actually determines health, health care is probably only responsible for 10% of health. And the other factors, the social, the environmental, the individual behavior, and genetics, are the vast majority of the determinants of health. So it's much more than just health care, which is how the term is often used. The kinds of issues that our subcommittee is looking at are looking at access to transportation at all income levels, what the costs are, what's the distribution of those services, what's the accessibility and mobility for vulnerable populations, which include communities of color, people with disabilities, the young, the older, the rural populations, and other historically marginalized population. There's also health and equity impacts for such things as job losses from automation and exposure to traffic and related impacts. So what I want to focus on is two proposals in draft that we have. You'll see them presented here, and then we have the more full proposal that I think got circulated, and if not, we can circulate it, that puts these in a little more details. But these are the highlights of what's in the proposals, and we want to get some feedback on them. So the first proposal is to conduct a structured public outreach related to health and equity issues and automated mobility. And the issue there is that typically marginalized communities, including people of color and people in areas that have had disinvestment over many years, tend to suffer from inequitable impacts when there is testing and implementation of new technologies. And these communities that are at risk of inequitable impacts are not well represented among decision makers, for that matter, even among the various committees that we have here. And it's been rather difficult to find representatives of these communities, in part because we don't have resources to pay an underrepresented community to sit on a committee. And so that one of the really essential things we believe is to have outreach to those communities. While it's not as ideal as having them well represented, at least it would hear what the concerns are. And so our proposal is to have some structured outreach, which is fairly common in the transportation community that such outreach be done. And it's for the purpose of better understanding the access, mobility, and health needs of the marginalized communities. So the actual proposal, which is written up on the form that either has been or will be circulated, is to have a structured engagement process to understand these needs. The outreach itself may be a little bit different than what happens in some other transportation projects, in that I think it's important that it include some education about autonomous vehicles and presentations of scenarios. So that if you go to people who've never heard of them and say, what do you think? You're not going to get a lot of useful feedback. But if that outreach includes an educational component and here's some scenarios where they might be used, and then ask for that feedback, I think it'll be a much better informed feedback once they understand what we're talking about. The results of this outreach would then, of course, be fed back to WSTC and to the various committees here with findings of what those concerns are and what some recommendations might be from that feedback. We've come up with an estimated cost, and this cost is basically a picked to be a reasonable number. If you had more money, you can do more outreach. If you had less money, you do less. And we wanted enough. There are certainly costs in doing the outreach in terms of who does the staffing, who does the travel or the Zoom kind of outreach, in terms of advertising it to get the appropriate people involved. And so we picked a number that we think is within the range of what could be funded. But ideally, if you had more, you could do more. If you had less, you would do what you could with it. But that's where the number comes from. It does not have here's the exact dollars for exactly how many sessions would you have with exactly how many people, but something that we think could get a reasonable amount of outreach done at a cost that is possible. And so the idea being that with such outreach and engagement, we could prevent or reduce inequitable consequences that could be associated, and would assist policymakers and industry to better meet the mobility and access needs of traditionally marginalized communities. So that's the first proposal. I think I'd like to present both proposals and then get feedback. So the first one is have funded outreach, trying to determine what some of the needs of mobility and access are for marginalized communities. The second is not one that has a specific cost attached to it, but is a recommendation to gather more information during the testing and implementation processes. And that looks at the background that the current law says that for companies that want to do testing, they had to provide, under current law, specific information that basically focuses on who they are, where the testing will be done on kind of the city, county level, which vehicles will be involved, and proof of insurance, all prior to pilot testing. And they're all reasonable recommendations. There's not a major burden to the companies to provide that. It allows the state to have some idea what's being done. Obviously, the proof of insurance has some cost, but that's the cost of doing business. The concern is that where this testing is being done could have inequitable health and safety impacts on the same traditionally marginalized communities, people of color, underinvested communities that we talked about in the first proposal. So the second proposal is that there be an amendment to the current law to look at some assessment of the testing locations prior to the pilot testing occurring on Washington streets and roadways. The actual content of those assessments is not to be specified at this point. We figure it could look at such things as what are some of the demographics, the traffic safety issues, the area characteristics of where the testing would go on. And the specific questions to be asked would be developed in partnership with the AV companies. And so that the state and private would decide what are the actual questions you're going to ask. But what the amendment would say is we want some type of assessment of where testing would be done. And it could be informed by some of the public outreach as to what some of the concerns are from proposal one. So the benefits of this would be that by knowing something about where these locations are, where the testing is being done, it would help facilitate equitable distributions of these benefits to all populations and reduce potential adverse impacts in these communities. The assessments would not be regulatory. They would not say, well, you can test in one place, you can't test in another, but it's much more to provide the information from which future decisions can be made. So it is intended to be a relatively low burden on the companies, and would say, here's some information about where testing is being done that can be part of future decision making. And asking for these assessments is consistent with prior recommendations from National Traffic Safety Board and quite a few other safety organizations to at least look at the safety issues of where testing is being done. And this would be a little bit broader than that in terms of finding out details of where testing will be done, but not being regulatory and not saying here's where you can test and here's where you can't test. So they're the two proposals, and we welcome feedback. I've been working with Paula Reeves, who's at the State Health Department, as well as the rest of the committee in developing these proposals, and we incorporated comments from the rest of the committee. So with that, I welcome your comments on your thoughts on these proposals. As I say, they are in draft and can be edited before they go further, before a vote is needed. I gather a vote could be at a future meeting of the executive committee, but at this point, we're looking for feedback on those proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dannenberg. Questions or comments for the Health and Equity Subcommittee or specific on their recommendations?
Yeah, hi, Andrew. Brian Mistling. So I'm curious, what do you see as an adverse impact to a disadvantaged community from testing AVs? My concern, to be honest, is there's so few testing right now happening within our state. And like you said, they're happening in multiple cities and you know, as these things drive around, I'm just concerned if, you know, the studies and would delay testing. And I'm not sure what a good example would be of an adverse impact from testing.
Okay, no, that's an appropriate question. One of the issues that came up was, should testing be done in disinvested communities, should it be tested in rich communities or poor communities? And the balance is, if you test them in poor communities, you are potentially putting people there at risk. You know, if something goes wrong in testing, you're putting people at risk. But the risk, if you only test in richer communities, then potentially they only get deployed to the richer communities. And the inequitable part is they haven't been tested in some of the disinvested communities, so they would not be deployed there. The intent is that the assessment is really a description of the area. It is not that a lengthy process, you know, if you think of things like environmental impact statements that, you know, make big dollars and big money. This is more almost a tabletop exercise. We plan to test in a particular zip code or a particular neighborhood. Here's what we know about the demographics of that area. So it's not intended to be burdensome and really would not be intended to delay. It's more of, here's, you know, maybe a page that you fill out that describes the area. But in answer to your question, that's the issue, is we think that where they're tested may be where they're deployed. And so that it's useful for decision makers to get some idea where testing is occurring.
Thank you, Dr. Dannenberg. We have another question. Bryce, I'm probably going to say this wrong. Yaden? Close? Okay, you're muted, but you have the floor. Go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, sorry about that. I had myself double muted. No, you said my last name perfect. Bryce Yaden with FeatureWise here. I just kind of wanted to add a little bit of context to what Brian just asked in terms of what FeatureWise is talking about and how we've been interacting with that community. I mean, when we talk about how we're working through that process, we know that the investment opportunities in communities is completely different in terms of how they're going to interact with people. So we know that when you look at South Seattle and North Seattle, where the vast majority of BIPOC communities exist, there's considerably less investment in sidewalks. So how does that interaction going to be in terms of health and safety? The second would be when we talk about how often are there marked crosswalks in certain communities? Where is the preponderance of higher speed boulevards in certain communities? And when you start unraveling all that, we know that in disinvested communities and highly impacted communities, that's where those occur. And so understanding and making sure that we're addressing those prior to testing, maybe not prior to testing, but understanding what those impacts are, is going to be extreme, and it is an extremely big deal, because if we have differences in infrastructure, we're going to see reactions that are going to be different. Also, who has access to what types of transportation options are a big deal. I think the final, which is fundamentally something that we're seeing, you know, my organization doesn't work in directly, but trying to figure out how to address it, is how do these vehicles see people, period. We know that, you know, I don't know if y'all noticed the latest thing that happened on Zoom, and an individual who was bald but had a beard, and where the background filled in certain aspects of his face. We're starting to see those racial discrepancies in terms of skin color and how that impacts it. So I think it's just really making sure that we address all of these and are looking at them and understanding the impact. And it's an infrastructure issue. It's a technological response issue, and making sure that we're not currently further overburdening certain populations.
Thank you, Bryce. We're starting to get some questions here. The next one is from Teresa Bernstein. Do you have thoughts on who would do the route testing?
I'm not sure I understand. The route testing is chosen by the AV companies. All we're asking is they describe what they've chosen. Is that, I'm not sure I understand the question.
No, thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, yeah. This is not at all us telling them where to test. It's simply describing to us what they've chosen.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. Next question we have is from Alex, Pazu. I'm sorry, I'm really probably making a mess of that name. Alex, did you want to come on and actually ask your question, or do you want me to ask it?
Sure. No, it was more of a statement to the question that was made about potential negative impact. This is Alex Pejukenix from the Seattle DOT. but previously a number of years in the city of Pittsburgh DOT with a number of AV testing operations. And one of the sort of lessons learned through the community engagement process was, ultimately a lot of testing was concentrated in a few particular neighborhoods in Pittsburgh because they were flat, level, and at right angles. And there is a certain amount of, adverse impact as a result of the concentration of testing, or perception of adverse impact as a result of the concentration of testing. So understanding where that testing occurs helps, the public sector provide adequate information so that the public can assess kind of their likelihood of interacting with an autonomous vehicle. But moreover, that we can make sure that we're not seeing kind of disproportionate amounts of congestion or emissions at scale once testing is kind of achieved at scale, with a lot of vehicles driving for, the purposes of testing, as opposed to with a particular origin and destination in mind as through travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is helpful, and that's the type of information that a description of where the testing is being done would tell you something about it.
Thank you, Alex. Next question we have is from Annabelle Chang. Annabelle, you have the floor.
Hi, this is Annabelle Chang at Waymo. I'm looking at proposal 1 about the public outreach. I think one of the concerns that just comes to mind for us is that, the AV industry in itself is so diverse. Even Scott's presentation before showed the different types of vehicles, the different types of use cases. And I think the concern would be that the public outreach isn't inclusive of that, or doesn't sort of capture all of the different elements. So for example, with Waymo, we don't need connected infrastructure for our technology. Our technology can operate on regular public roads without that type of technology. So there are certain, I think, elements that we just want to make sure that is fully representative of the direction of the industry, and even the new directions that may come about.
Yeah, that's a very helpful comment. I guess my one thought on that is, if you notice, there's a thing about scenarios, and I think it would be very appropriate in the outreach. As I mentioned, we want education. Before you ask for comments, you say, here's what you're responding to, and those scenarios could certainly be a whole range of what industry is doing, everything from what we just saw about freight delivery to driverless cars that have passengers and so forth, but you could present a number of scenarios that reflect what industry is doing as part of that outreach, and then get reactions to those different scenarios.
Okay, thank you very much, Annabelle. Next question is from Mariah Frost. Why do you think the location and income level of its residents where an AV is tested would necessarily tie the AV deployment to that location? Wouldn't the testing be tied more to the type of road, arterial highway, etc., the vehicle is tested on?
I guess we don't know. Where things are tested, that would be up to the companies where they end up deploying. I guess I just use that as one of the possible examples, that where it's tested is where deployment is more likely. And I'm not saying it's necessarily directly to the income. It is probably more to the infrastructure that is there, but infrastructure, as someone mentioned earlier, does tie somewhat to the income levels of the community as to who has better infrastructure. But yeah, we don't know what choices the companies may make between where they test and where they deploy, but there certainly could be a relationship.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from an autonomous attendee. How will emissions be a problem when nearly all AV testing is being done with electric vehicles?
I think that's probably correct. Probably somebody else knows more about emissions and what's expected, but I think that is a correct statement, that emissions is less likely to be a problem if it's primarily electric vehicles.
And last, from Rad Cunningham, is it possible that we could design the assessment such that all the information could be accessed through the Washington tracking network, making the process quick and easy?
I guess it would depend whether the tracking, it would depend, as first, what information we want to collect, which would be decided, as mentioned, by the industry working with public input, I mean, with the public agencies. And then if the information for which there was desire to be, if the information you want to collect is in that tracking network, it could potentially come that route, but it really depends what questions are being asked and whether that information is available through that tracking network.
Thank you, Doctor. Other questions or comments for Dr. Dannenberg? Yes, John. John Milbrath, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Just wanted to follow up really quickly on a couple of comments made just about the study, the impact study, and kind of what the desired outcome of that is. My concern about this sort of activity is that we're, as you've already pointed out, we're talking about scenario-based, potentially hypothetical situations because we don't, we're not able to witness this in real time. And so I'm wondering what we gain from sort of talking about this in the abstract that maybe we already have, or I mean, what tangible are we going to get from it?
Okay. Are you asking about the testing location assessment or about the outreach, or both?
I'm asking about the outreach, just, okay. Talking to communities about the impact of this when we're talking about still in, for the most part, a hypothetical situation.
Well, I think the hypotheticals are what industry sees as may happen. I mean, obviously industry is working on where they would like to see things go and, realizing not all of those hypotheticals will exist. But I would expect at least some of the hypotheticals are where things are headed, because the scenarios would come from industry, and it's what they're thinking may happen, and then getting reactions to them. I mean, it's possible some of those reactions will say, yeah, this looks reasonable. It also would say, hey, here's a concern of what it could do to myself or my children, or the lack of sidewalks here puts me at more risk. I mean, there's a whole range of possible feedback there. But I think the hypotheticals, which would be designed with industry, are reasonably likely where we're headed, because they would be asking industry, where do you think you're headed?
Other questions or comments for Dr. Dannenberg?
I've got a comment, if that's okay.
Yes, Eric.
And it's mostly a comment, but certainly welcome the reaction. So I guess the comment is really that I'm left a little bit perplexed as to what the objective of the second recommendation is. So it's not intended to be a requirement, but it's an assessment. The current legislation that was enacted requires the submission of the local jurisdictions where testing is planned to be part of the permit application process. That's already provided. And maybe it was, we had more time or something, we could expand on it, but I remain, especially with the emissions comments about emissions, about that not being an issue, I'm left a little bit perplexed as to what is being assessed in addition to the location itself that's already being provided. And so, and forgive me for characterizing it this way, it seems a little bit as if it's in search of some sort of answer or the question before we have any, or it answers before we have the question. So in other words, it's not clear that there have been specific issues identified. We're not aware of what those could be in the aggregate or even with specificity. And yet it should be assessed in advance of that. And part of me thinks that maybe it's the kind of thing where with the bill in place and the regime, the framework established, being able to move forward as is and to look ahead and get to a point after a period of time to then determine whether this second recommendation is necessary based upon some observations that are made with the current framework in place. That might make a little bit more sense. So that's just my observation and comment, but certainly welcome any response and thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, I hear what you're saying. I guess my understanding of the current rules would just be, here's the city or county where it's being done. That says nothing about the neighborhoods or nothing about the demographics or equity issues. If you just say it's happening in Seattle or happening in King County, it tells you nothing at all about which neighborhoods or equity issues of where it's being tested. The decision of what information to collect, would be decided by a work between industry and the public agency. So it's not upfront saying, here's what you have to collect. And I would certainly lean toward, less is more, not trying to make a complicated process. It could be, one page, here's some basic demographics, here's some, information on percent sidewalks in the area. It could be something that's really pretty straightforward. It's not intended to be an exhaustive assessment, which I know can get very burdensome. I mean, I'm saying one page without knowing what it would look like, but aiming for that level of information rather than, a long, complicated process.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Other questions, comments?
Pam, this is Pam,
Yes,
Cook
Pam.
Traffic Safety Commission. I guess my response to that is, I think it's, maybe this recommendation is premature, and until we have a better understanding of what that information would be, it may be better to hold off, because at one point I heard that it would be a description of the area, which, and when you just leave it really broad in terms of some assessment, I think there's a potential for this to go really wrong or really right. But until we have a better understanding of what that assessment would include, maybe this recommendation is premature.
Thank you. I guess the intent is that we would not want to define the assessment in advance, but have industry working with the transportation agencies to see what questions. They could come up with some very short, very simple questions that were agreeable to both. But if you wait till you had a very lengthy process before you even say it's worth assessing, then it really wouldn't happen, whereby this is intended to be open-ended and with industry's input to decide what information is needed. And it'd certainly be fine, as I say, it could be one page with a handful of simple questions would meet this. So that's the reason not to decide ahead what questions till there is that input as to what is needed.
Okay, other questions or comments?
Yeah, Ariel, Brian Mistley again. So I guess I would second Pam's comment, mainly because I'm confused on the presuppositions. Because, for instance, testing in a low-income area, is that good or bad? Meaning, there may be higher risk of accidents, but if you don't test in low-income areas, maybe the AVs, when they go to production, they don't understand that infrastructure. Maybe the infrastructure is different between high-income areas and low-income areas. So maybe you want testing in low-income areas. So again, I'm struggling with the presuppositions in terms of how we decide what's good, what's bad. Because again, all AVs that are being tested today, they're looking for different diverse sets of road infrastructure, road geometry to basically build their test cases to make these things more safe. They are primarily looking at the income of the people in the areas. So this is why I'm kind of struggling with the recommendation.
Yeah. This very explicitly is not trying to say, here's a good place to test and here's a bad place to test. It's trying to gather some information so down the road, decision makers can decide we have and we have not tested in certain areas. Here's places where we want to encourage or discourage implementation. But it very much is not trying to say this is good or bad to test in higher low income areas.
This is Annabelle again at Waymo. Going back to proposal 1 about the public outreach, I know there's a little bit of discussion among the panelists. One thing I was thinking of as Ariel spoke was, I think the part that is unclear is when we do this outreach, we could be reaching out to communities that will never have AV testing because of the remoteness or as we said, like maybe it's incredibly steep or something along those lines where it just doesn't make sense. And the question is kind of understanding sort of what the landscape is before even engaging in such a large scale public outreach effort. What I had kind of suggested initially is really, I would say, two things: polling industry to understand kind of where they would contemplate testing, right? And then second, and where they could contemplate actually launching a service. And then second, I think polling sort of and communities to understand if they've even heard of, these autonomous services prior to creating a large scale public outreach campaign, because I think it gives, I'm just looking at the budget, $30,000 for a full state would be, is pretty ideal. But I'm just trying to understand kind of how we would even engage in that effort without sort of every person getting a tiny little bit of information that might not be, in fact, applicable to them in any time in the near future.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments. The idea, what we're asking is that there be outreach. The actual procedures would need to be worked out as to who the outreach is to, and would certainly want to rely on people who have done outreach before. And my understanding is transportation agencies routinely do outreach, which means they're used to figuring out who do you do outreach to. So that, again, we would not decide up front, gee, it should or shouldn't go to a particularly rural area or a steep area or whatever, but to have an outreach intent and then have those with some expertise deciding what is the best use of who the outreach should be to.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments for Dr. Dannenberg?
Yeah, this is Justin Layton at WSTA. Just some general comments of some of the conversations I'm hearing. And, in the public transportation world, we're mandated to do outreach, particularly around communities of color and low income. Title VI analysis is done whenever agencies either want to add significant service or cut significant service, change a fare, how much charges there are. So I think it's a little interesting to me, a little bit of the pushback of just wanting to do outreach, particularly by folks who are on this executive committee who get to have a say in a lot of the direction we're going. I read this recommendation as just that there should be outreach done at some point, and that needs to be defined in greater detail later. I definitely would like to understand more where this testing will go, and we should be ensuring that this testing isn't disproportionately impacting one community over another, is the testing always going to be in a certain area or not? And so I think that those are very general areas, and perhaps this committee will go back and understand deeper what types of assessments need to be teased out here. Is it an assessment on the community, the infrastructure in that community? Is that community disproportionately impacted by other modes of transportation? And things like that. So I think that those are general assessments that I see. And then the outreach is important. We live in a state where we pride ourselves on public outreach. And we should be fully embracing that, particularly as we develop and implement and actually provide services.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Other questions or comments for Dr. Dannenberg?
This is Laura Johnson. I'm with the Washington Department of Health, and just really appreciate this presentation. And I think one of the things that I find really important is to make sure we're bringing communities along throughout the process. That a lot of times, if we're waiting too long in, then we're cutting off options and we're cutting off ways that they can be engaged and provide kind of new perspectives that we might be not thinking about or could overlook. And so I think there's just some value in having people engaged throughout. And I think especially for something like this that really has the potential to very much transform people's lives and the way we interact and the way we move in very fundamental ways. So I think that, what's being asked for here, it seems it's a very, it's not enough, right? But it's a starting point to start getting that engagement going and to start asking those questions and really to start listening. I think that's the important piece, is to be listening and gathering that information from people directly. But I totally get the need for the education as well. So I like how that has been framed. And then I did also just want to share, because I know it came up, is Washington Tracking Network is a tool at the department that the Department of Health hosts. That's a way of getting largely public health data out to the public. And one of the tools within that is a map that has demographic information as well as kind of air quality and other data. And so I can see how that would be a very useful tool to do an overlay of where's the testing happening. And part of that too is if we're not able to test in certain areas and that's going to disadvantage those areas later on, then having that information in the beginning so that we can then maybe make some investments in those communities to get them to a place where that could happen feels like an important piece too, because I see how you could go down this path of farther disadvantaging communities without kind of having that valuable information. So thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Any additional questions for Dr. Dannenberg? If not, we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up because we have another subcommittee that needs to present. Hearing, seeing none. Okay, Dr. Dannenberg, thank you so much for your presentation. Please thank the Committee on Health and Equity, the subcommittee, for the work that they did on this. This will come back to us in November for a vote, but in the meantime, we'll be tweaking it and making changes as working with the subcommittees.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next item is a presentation from the co-chairs from the licensing subcommittee. Do we have Bo Perschbacher and Drew Wilder on the call? Yes, Drew, I see you. Bo, are you there?
Yes, can you hear and see me as well?
Yes, sir, we can. You guys have the floor.
All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen here. 1 second. All right, are you able to see my presentation?
Yes, sir, we are.
Okay, great. So Bo Perschbacher, Legislative and Policy Director for Departmental Licensing, co-chair of the Licensing Subcommittee, along with Drew Wilder. We're both going to be doing this presentation, so got the first slides here. So this is an overview of what we're going to be covering. We're going to look at the autonomous vehicle bill that passed last session, a brief update on the implementation of that, and some of the discussion that our subcommittee had on Section 2 of the bill, which is scheduled to take effect October 1st of next year. We also had some discussion as a subcommittee on the Uniform Law Commission bill, HB 2470, which was introduced as well in the Washington State Legislature. We're also going to talk about some of the research and discussion our subcommittee had on the regulatory autonomous vehicle models from California and Arizona. And finally, just talking about some key takeaways that our subcommittee had. We don't have any recommendations, but we had some items that there seemed to be some level of consensus on, and just so wanted to see how those landed on the executive committee and to get your feedback. So I know we've talked about HB 2676 before. Just very quickly, the requirement that's in effect now is that $5 million insurance policy. There are additional requirements that will take effect next year. That includes certain information that needs to be submitted to Department of Licensing, such as contact information, local jurisdictions where they plan to test the vehicles, vehicle identification information, other information. The testing entities have to provide notice to law enforcement before testing on the public roadways, and they have to report annually to DOL any infractions and collisions that occur when the vehicle is in the autonomous mode, and also requires DOL to make certain information available to the public and report annually to the legislature. So just a quick update on the implementation efforts. We have that updated self-certification form for the companies. We work with the liability committee to make sure we have the right requirements around providing that insurance documentation. All the participants in the program were notified. We have 6 companies that have continued in the program, including 1 new company, 5 companies that asked to be removed, and 7 that did not return the insurance information and so were removed from the program. These are those companies that are current participants in the self-certification program. Now, talking about HB 2676 regarding Section 2, this was some of the discussion that our subcommittee had on that proposal. There was some feedback from the industry that it could be difficult for testing entities to know which sort of law enforcement entities they would need to notify if they're doing testing throughout the state, which may involve a variety of small towns and other areas. So that was just one piece of feedback we wanted to pass on that was part of the discussion. There was also a lot of different opinions on the right amount of data for collision reporting. So there was a certain line of thinking that said maybe this should only be reported when the autonomous vehicle was at fault, and perhaps only when the autonomous vehicle system was engaged. And there's others on the subcommittee who felt, well, if we're only capturing it when the autonomous vehicle is at fault, we may lose potentially useful data on if maybe the way that the AVs are interacting with normal drivers could be causing the behavior of the AV in that way could be causing a collision in some way. And so there was, some thought that maybe it would be helpful to have that. Similarly, there was a pretty robust discussion around whether it was appropriate to have it reported just when the AV system was engaged or not, and some discussion of, well, if there are transition points between it being engaged and disengaged, and there could be collisions associated with the transition, are we concerned about not having that data? So there certainly wasn't consensus on any of these items, but just to give you a sense of some of the back and forth discussion that we had as a subcommittee. One of the things that sort of came out of this that seemed like there was more consensus on was this idea of a law enforcement protocol that would sort of describe how law enforcement should interact with autonomous vehicles being tested in the state. And that also came up in our research into California and Arizona that Drew will cover in a little bit as well. So one of the other items we discussed at a meeting was the Uniform Law Commission proposal. Overall, I would say in our subcommittee discussion, there was quite a bit of industry concerns about the proposal. One of the central discussion points that we had as a subcommittee was what was the role of the federal versus the state government in regulating the vehicle itself. And traditionally, under sort of current law, vehicle safety standards are regulated by the federal government. That's not an area where DO really has involvement right now. And so there was this discussion around if, DOL is being asked to sort of technically evaluate the safety of these vehicles, the hardware, the software, we don't have that in-house expertise now. Would we be able to acquire that? Would we have the option of licensing a third party perhaps that may have that expertise? And then that sort of led into a discussion of one of the challenges of finding an impartial third party that has enough expertise to evaluate the technology, but doesn't have a sort of a vested interest either way and succeed and wanting that to succeed because maybe they're closely associated with the industry or part of an industry group. So there was some discussion around that, if there were actors that had the expertise but were still impartial on that. Another item that came up was the potential of Washington to just adopt the standards of another state. One example that someone proposed was California, which I know we do on a variety of other regulatory issues, environmental, and some others, as a way to potentially still have a standard, but not have to sort of recreate it all ourselves as Washington. And then finally, there was some discussion about the level of risk the state is assuming by having this sort of state in this position of approving these providers and what risk that would potentially establish for the state government if we were to do that. So there was some just discussion around those kind of items as well. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Drew to talk a little about California and Arizona.
Okay. As a committee, we took a look at the State of California autonomous vehicles regulations, and it appears in examining the regulation that it specifically applies to the testing of AVs for manufacturers only. However, unlike many other states, California does require a minimum of $5 million in liability coverage. Acceptable forms of insurance would be a surety bond, certificate of insurance, or a letter of self-insurance. As far as the permits go, the manufacturers are required to submit their applications to the Department of Motor Vehicles. The permits are good for a 2-year period at a cost of $3,600 per application. The regulation also mandates some testing requirements for drivers, the test drivers themselves, which are, some of them are, drivers are to be in immediate physical control of the vehicle, or the driver must be monitoring the operation of the vehicle and be in a situation where they can take control of the vehicle if needed. These drivers must be employees or contractors of the manufacturer. They have to have been licensed for a minimum of 3 years prior to the application being submitted, and have no moving violations, including drugs or alcohol. The regulation also includes something that Bo mentioned earlier, which is referred to as a law enforcement interaction plan. This requires manufacturers to provide certain data to local authorities. Some of that data would include the operational design domain of the test vehicles, a list of the public roadways these vehicles are going to be operating on, the number of vehicles to be tested, and the contact information for the individuals that are actually be doing the testing themselves. The regulation also requires manufacturers to report to Department of Motor Vehicles all collisions within a 10-day period and disengagements annually. In other words, if a vehicle is operating in autonomous mode and for some reason disengages to manual, the manufacturer is to record that data and report it to DMV on an annual basis. As of May 6th of this year, 71 testing permits had been issued, 3,000 drivers certified. However, 256 accidents had been reported, primarily in the states of San Francisco and Palo Alto, California. This regulation also excludes the testing of certain vehicles, which are trailers with fifth wheels, motorcycles, motor vehicles with interstate operating authority, and vehicles that exceed a gross weight of 10,000 pounds or more. Next slide. In our follow-up discussions, our subcommittee follow-up discussions in respects to examining the Washington regulation, we saw potential for the state of Washington to develop enforcement interaction plan, and that's something that we plan to talk with the safety subcommittee about in the near future. We did agree that having all of the details on an AV would not necessarily be required, but who to contact if something goes wrong, how to shut the AV off, how to tow it, things like that were very important. We had a few concerns around proprietary data. In other words, how is that data going to be protected? Another thing that we got is that we agreed that we see that there's a potential for Washington to define the automated levels that would be required for self-certification. Most of us thought that levels 4 and 5 would be appropriate for self-certification. However, California was statutorily required to use levels 3 and above. Next slide. We also had discussions about self-certification versus reviewing and approving applications, such as in California. As previously mentioned, California provides a hands-on approach doing the application process as well as doing the life cycle of the permit itself. So the question is that having an on-hands approach in the state of Washington, would that expose the state to further risk, or could it in fact be a benefit? Another area of concern is that what is the value of requiring the reporting of disengagements? In other words, at what point does the data collection exceed what we really need to understand how these AVs work in autonomous mode? We did agree that reporting disengagements could in fact help us understand the transition points between AV mode and regular mode and how that might be linked to any type of collision. Next slide. As Bo mentioned, we also examined Arizona's regulation, and Arizona follows a self-certification process as well. However, the regulation does provide for a law enforcement interaction protocol or action plan. The regulation also allows for the operation, of passengers to be transported, just not testing. Now, when it comes to the interaction protocol plan, what that involves is that the tester is required to provide law enforcement with things such as, who the fleet specialist is when these vehicles are being operated, how to safely remove the vehicles from roadways, how to recognize whether the vehicle is in autonomous mode and how to deal with that, a description of the cities where these vehicles are going to be operated, and any additional information that the tester may deem necessary for local law enforcement to have. In our follow-up discussion, what we're saying is that the law enforcement protocol or action plan seems to be a common theme, and it's something that we definitely plan to explore in the future. We also need to shift our discussions of licensing regulatory issues to include deployment as well. To this point, we primarily focused on the training. At this point, I'll turn the presentation back over to Bob.
Thanks, Drew. Just to recap, some of our key takeaways from the meetings over the summer and the spring has been that it seems like there was quite a bit of interest on defining what level of AVs are subject to self-certification. So wanted to, open that up for the exec committee's thoughts as well. We discussed maybe whether that would be appropriate to do through our rulemaking, or if a potential legislative change would be needed to give agencies more direction to do that kind of rulemaking as an option. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And we want to look more at this idea of the law enforcement interaction plan. Although I think as the licensing subcommittee, we recognize that it's probably most appropriate for the safety subcommittee to take this on. So that likely will be one that gets passed off to them. But just sort of bringing that issue for your awareness that seems to keep coming up. And then finally, just some of the future meetings we're looking at would be some of the regulatory models for autonomous vehicles in other countries. And we've had some short but good discussions on the licensing issues with agricultural autonomous vehicles. And so that's something we're looking at pursuing as well. And certainly if this group has feedback for us that they would like us to look into as licensing subcommittee, we welcome that as well. And with that, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions. So Drew and I both are.
Questions? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Questions or comments for the licensing subcommittee member, or co-chairs, excuse me. Any questions for the licensing subcommittee? I'll remind you that if you do want to speak, just unmute your microphone and get my attention. I'll call on you.
Maybe I can just ask, Jim, if I can just, does anyone have any concerns with us potentially trying to define the AV levels through rulemaking? Is that something that, there's the public hearing, there's comment, of course, on that under the APA, but that was something we considered, and we wanted to just see if anyone had concerns about that idea.
Any questions, comments, or concerns that Bo brought up? Yes, Kurt.
Yes, hi, I'm Kurt Augustine with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Yes, we do have some concerns because of the ever-changing nature of both federal and state laws, and there is a shift away from the level definitions, especially at the federal level. So it's sort of a cart before the horse kind of thing, and the issue is important, but there are concerns about linking it to the SCA level definitions. And then also the other point, there were in your California presentation, which was good, that's indicative of some of the issues where the bill became law so long ago and things have changed that California oddly, in an effort to lead the pack, in some ways now is behind the pack because they're wedded to a 8-year-old statute, and it's very difficult to change, and has often caused a lot of companies not to want to test in California, ironically, when the actual technology is being developed in the state, but then they test it outside the state. So thank you.
Yes, Annabelle Chang.
Echoing Kurt here, Waymo being based in California, but most of our testing and operations are now occurring in Arizona. Partly, California has 2 different regulatory agencies. So one is the Department of Motor Vehicles, and then the other is the California Public Utilities Commission. And they are they each have their own jurisdictions, and some of it overlaps. So one, for example, I would say the CPUC primarily touches on passenger carriage. And on the other hand, in Arizona, it is just the Arizona DOT, which is a lot more straightforward. So we've been able to do, we've actually had our early rider program in Arizona, first in the world there, where we've been able to do pickups and drop-offs of true rider only, meaning there's no driver in the car, happening in the city of Chandler. And we're also able to begin trucking testing as well there. So just to give you a little bit of context, I mean, certainly the Arizona framework has made it a lot easier for us to expand our testing and our footprint.
And Mr. Chair, can I just ask a follow-up on that for both Annabelle and Kurt? And you know, part of in our subcommittee discussion, why we thought it may be good to do it through agency rulemaking with defining what the self-certification is applicable to is because it would be so much easier to change it and it'd be agile than if it were to be in statute and require a statutory change. Do you see any problems now with not having it sort of defined anywhere? I guess that was sort of what we were essentially trying to clarify and improve, but if we're making it worse by not doing it, I definitely want to know that.
And Bo, for myself, I need to double check on that. I haven't encountered that myself yet, and so I want to get back to you before I give you a confirmed answer.
Secretary Millard, did you have a question? Okay, thank you, sir.
No, sir.
Oh, sorry, sir. I thought I saw you raise your hand. Other questions or comments?
This is Rep. Kloba. I do have a question, and please tell me if this is better answered offline, because it's kind of a question for Annabelle. One of the things I've been curious about is, you know, ultimately you're creating a product that's kind of based on software. And generally in the software industry, you know, you have certain gates that you go through, and you get to a certain point where you feel like it's going to be able to perform reasonably well, and you do a beta test, and then you put it out into the public, and there are a variety of different screens. And at some point, you reach a conclusion where now this product is ready to go out onto the general market. And, you know, coming from a place where Boeing had some autonomous software that they were adding into their planes, and we've seen how there were some, I think, gaps in how they tested it and how they understood how a pilot would interact with it given certain situations. And of course, that's turned out to be quite deadly and really devastating to the company. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, you know, in the aviation industry, I think Bo even mentioned, you know, agricultural AV testing. At what point or what screens do you have where you know now this is reasonable for us to put out onto the street now, and then that jump from there to now it's reasonable for us to put passengers in this vehicle? Like, what kind of certainty does the public have, and maybe where does the state come into that with putting some guidelines on that for companies?
Yeah, and it's a little bit hard for me to go through sort of all of the background. And I'll confess I am about 5 weeks in at Waymo, so I can share what I know. So for example, the Google self-driving car project launched in 2010. We did not have operations in Arizona until 2017. So that was 7 years of testing. And then in 2018, did we first have our early rider program begin. So that was 8 years later from the initial technology. And so what I would say is that I think the milestones, both internally and frankly from a regulatory perspective, have created enough, I would say, enough time and testing. As background, we've done 15 billion miles of simulated testing. And I think and I have to double check the number, but multi-millions of miles of real on-road testing. But I think that safety is always top of mind. I mean, I think that is unquestionably the thing that we think about day in and day out. But we do have active driverless operations in Arizona where members of the public, as part of our early rider program, are going in and about and taking these rides and giving us feedback and providing concerns and ideas for us to iterate and improve.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments for the licensing subcommittee? Drew, did you have something?
Well, I just interested to know from the committee. Bo had mentioned, and I also talked about in our discussions, the value of self-certification versus, approving these applications or having some type of assurance that, the software or et cetera is working the way that it should. Is there, in respects to liability, is there any concerns there, or would it be beneficial for a state to do so, to follow self-certification, or maybe have some type of oversight or some type of on-hands approach?
And I think, speaking to Arizona, that the self-certification has gone fairly smoothly. So that would be sort of my feedback. That's where we have the most active testing and operations, and it's gone fairly well at this point.
Mr. Wolf, you came on. Did you have a question?
Well, thanks. I actually was just going to amplify or add on to Annabelle's answer to Representative Kloba, and just note, of course, the backdrop of all of this is the federal government's role in setting standards for the design and performance of vehicles in the safety context. In the AV area, I think we're probably all familiar with the ongoing sort of, call it a bit of a tension, right, between federal and state as standards continue to evolve. But there is a healthy amount of guidance that's been issued by USDOT, NHTSA. There, of course, are safety self-assessments. Those are voluntary, but have been performed and put out by a number of companies. And then, of course, the backstop, which is NHTSA does have the authority to enforce against any individual or company that puts a vehicle out that presents an unreasonable risk to safety. So, in that respect, there is a backstop. I mean, we'll see as time moves forward, sort of the extent of that. Congress is actually, earlier today, the legislation was reintroduced to set a federal framework that would really speak to that kind of safety assurance that was referenced by Representative Kloba earlier. So I referenced that because, of course, we're speaking about state level issues which are critically important, and how to set the framework for at the state level. But that federal level, does exist, and it is in the process of evolution. It's going to be critically important to make sure we understand how each component presents itself in the safety framework for AVs.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Okay, I think we're good. I don't see any questions in the box, so I think we're going to go ahead and move on. I want to thank the licensing subcommittee for the work that they did. We're definitely going to bring this back and have more conversations about this, I'm sure. If you do have other issues, please let me or Rima or the staff know so we can get this on the agenda to have discussions in November. We will hear from the other 5 subcommittees at our November 12th, 2020 meeting. So without any other questions, comments, we're going to go ahead and move on. Next item on the agenda, we're going to hear from Secretary of Transportation Roger Millar regarding national developments on cooperative automated transportation. Mr. Secretary Millar, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me bring my presentation up, and here we go. Well, it's great to be sort of with everybody today. Hope you're well wherever you are. Wanted to give you an update on what's happening around the country and how we're participating in that. So wanted to talk about CAT versus AV and our strong desire as an agency to take a CAT perspective and hopefully encourage all of you to do the same. What's happening in terms of policy development here in Washington, national initiatives, how we're preparing, and conclusions, hopefully with some time for answering some questions. So how does AV relate to CAT? You know, the legislature set this up as an AV working group, and that's great, but we all know what an AV is, connected autonomous vehicle. What cooperative automated transportation is, as it's been defined nationally, it's deploying technology to encourage all of our modes of transportation to work together in concert. It's about automating functions or access to various vehicle types, and it's about the entire transportation system, not just the vehicle. So, you know, a way to think about it, here's CAT, here's CAV. There's all this stuff going on in the automated space that we need to be advising the legislature in particular, what's the state's role in this? What's the local role? What's the private role? How do we work together in this space where, yeah, there's a lot of interest in connected and autonomous vehicles, but there's a lot of interest in a lot of other things in this automated space that need to be on our radar. So here in Washington State, we've been talking about it at the DOT. We've been encouraging the conversation here. The executive committee endorsed some policy goals back in 2019. And if you're talking about connected and autonomous vehicles, you look at this and you look at land use and equity and go, but if you're thinking about that entire space, we do need to think about how we as a state and we as state agencies working with local agencies, working with the private sector, working with the not-for-profit sector, how do we organize best for innovation leadership? How do we share mobility? How do we make sure that the economic vitality and livability of the state is actually enhanced by this? That we address the infrastructure, certainly, and that's something I'm concerned about, that we address land use, and we make sure that our land development patterns are the land development patterns our citizens want, that it supports multimodal connectivity, and it's not again, auto-dominated. Equity is a huge part of this, safety, we've been talking about that a lot this morning, and the environment are all important, and I'm glad that we were, as an executive committee, able to endorse these goals, and I'm hopeful that the other subcommittees are working with them in mind. So there's that. So what's happening at the national level? There's a group called the Cooperative Automated Transportation Coalition. It's a joint cooperative effort between the U.S. Department of Transportation and AASHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, the Institute for Transportation Engineering, and ITS America. You can tell we're all into acronyms. And this coalition was formed to be a focal point for everyone to come together. We have obviously the states involved, but infrastructure owners and operators, the OEMs are all there, technology and service providers, academia is there, consultants and IoT suppliers. here's how we're organized. I have the honor of co-chairing the group with my colleague, Jennifer Cohen from the Delaware DOT. She used to run their DMV there before she took over DelDOT, and brings a really interesting perspective. But we're looking at programmatic and strategic activities. We're looking at planning and resources, and we're looking at infrastructure and industry and how the two interact. And the infrastructure owner operator original equipment manufacturer forum is a huge bonus place, just in terms of people who don't normally interact day to day working together. And then below all of that, we have a peer exchange and outreach working group that's supporting all of the areas. I know a number of people around our table at a national level. Their organizations are a big part of this, and there's a lot going on. The infrastructure owners and operators, and as secretary, that's how I see WashDOT. We own for the citizens that we serve, and we operate infrastructure. We came up with some guiding principles for CAT that are around automation and the sharing of data and telecommunications and the protection and utilization of the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum, about operational capabilities related to safety and mobility and equity and efficiency, and about the importance of collaboration and communication. So from our agency's perspective, with these guiding principles in hand, this is our approach and our team's approach to local government, to the private sector, to the not-for-profit sector, all the different groups that are in this space. There's a new technical concepts document out there for folks that are interested in this. It overviews CAT, it overviews the guiding principles, and it gets down into the weeds of how you make all of this happen. And just so that you're aware, there's a resource out there available to you. Another group that's involved in this is the Intelligent Transportation Society of America, ITS America. The FAST Act is being reauthorized. This is the Federal Transportation Act. It's going to take some time, but the conversation's going on, and a question that we've had and advocacy that we've been doing and information that we need to share with you is the Federal Act is going to incorporate ITS, Intelligent Transportation Systems, and we need to be ready for that in terms of how we respond as an agency, how our partner agencies respond, and how the legislature kind of oversees and gives policy direction to us. So safer is important. We're asking for increased investments in research and development. We want to look at cybersecurity. The whole issue of the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum, it was set aside for transportation and safety. There's a huge debate going on now about giving that space up to others in industry for other purposes. We want to expand investments in advanced mobility. We want to plan for transformative transportation technologies and deploying broadband. So all of this is in the current draft of the bill, at least on the House side. We want it to be greener, increase the build out of alternative fuel infrastructure, and again, this transformative and adaptive deployment. And we want it to be smarter. There is actually a mobility on demand title in the bill, the ITS Program Advisory Committee, and strengthening the university transportation centers, of which Washington's are represented here on our executive committee, but more money for research, which is going to be important as this emerges. Another place that we're engaged is the ITS America Mobility on Demand Alliance. I sit on the ITS America board and I co-chair the Mobility on Demand Alliance. We're looking at treating transportation as a commodity, supply and demand, and going from transportation as from it being a product you own to a service you consume. So we're focused on traveler and personal choice. We're focused on being mode agnostic and what mode best satisfies the trip. It's got to be built on data, and we need to be looking at a management framework for managing supply and demand rather than just having a mishmash of uncoordinated activity. So we're very involved in, and again, talking about federal reauthorization, the definition of mobility on demand, and building that into the transportation space with federal policy. We are engaged in international partnerships. We have a collaboration with the European MOS Alliance. In Europe, they call it mobility as a service instead of mobility on demand. We just had to be different. And we also have a partnership with the Asian Pacific group. So the idea is to steal good ideas. And I think we're doing pretty well there. And then we're engaged in we do a lot of surveying to assess the awareness of mobility on demand, customer understanding, and how it's being adopted. And it is being adopted. It's all around us, whether it's dockless e-scooters or bike share or microtransit or ride pooling or bike sharing or ride sourcing or P2P car sharing or one-way car sharing. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of this that really is more of a local government private sector interaction as opposed to a state government private sector interaction. But the legislature needs to be informed on what it may need to enable or preempt, those kinds of things. So it's important to be up to speed on what's happening with mobility on demand. And then the Open Mobility Foundation, I believe Rima sent out some information about a webinar on this, but this is about data. Municipalities across the country have joined together. They've created a not-for-profit called the Open Mobility Foundation that's looking at open source software for managing the data and the relationship between the public sector and the private sector on the sharing of data. This started with the mobility data specification down in Los Angeles. It's now nationwide. The Open Mobility Foundation has a board of directors. I believe that Sam Zimbabwe up at City of Seattle is on that board of directors. They're doing some good work in terms of establishing a set of data standards, a common platform that encourage data sharing and fair payment integration and competition, while addressing the issues of privacy and trade secrets and equity that are really high on everybody's list of concerns as soon as you start talking about data. So anyway, that's a forum where stuff is going on, and I would encourage everybody on the executive committee, if you have the time, sit in on that webinar and learn more about it, because I would rather, as someone with limited resources, I'd rather not reinvent wheels that have already been invented somewhere else. So what are we doing at WSTC in the mod space? Equity is the focus of what we've been doing. We've developed some core principles and emphasis areas. We have a TDM executive board at WSTC that is back in our commute trip reduction space, but it's been looking at mobility on demand. We had a workshop with all the stakeholders earlier this year, and this is what's come out of it so far. We're looking at the environment, connectivity, data, safety, and the user experience. We want to establish data standards that encourage data sharing and fair payment integration and competition, that regulate and support and pay for the general transit speed specification flex adoption, which is how you get transit industry information into the data sharing space. And then we're testing and piloting a first mile, last mile program that the legislature authorized in the 1921 budget. So GTFS Flex is about, when you go on your app, and it's whether it's Google or Waze or whatever you use, and you ask, how do I get from here to there? If the transit agencies have entered their data in a GTFS format, and the service provider, the app provider, is able to access that data, you'll know how you can get from here to there. And they were doing that with fixed routes, but GTFS Flex allows you to incorporate the demand responsive transportation, the stuff that we're doing that is where we're doing public-private partnerships with the private sector, the TNCs around the state. So having GTFS Flex adopted by transit agencies in Washington is going to better prepare us for this mobility on demand thing that's happening. We have urban and rural transit agencies around the state. 31 of them have flexible service, and we've partnered with the UTCs and King County Metro to advance this adoption. It's happening around Washington as we speak. So we're working on electric vehicle charging. We've done a lot in the I-5 corridor, and we're moving off the corridor to other places. But what we want to kind of do with this map is get the red out. The red is where we do not have charging or sufficient charging in terms of high priorities. The peninsula, Highway 12 corridor, Highway 2 corridor, the eastern side of the state. We need to do more on this. There was a push for a while. We will probably need to push again because we're reaching a place on the private side where it's becoming more affordable, but you got to have the place to charge your car, charge your truck, charge your bus, what have you. We're a part of the West Coast Electric Highway. The FHWA is designated I-5, 82, 90, and 101 as EV corridors. We are, again, working with our Oregon partners, our California partners on a whole bunch of stuff. Broadband accommodation is another space in cooperative automated transportation where we need to be talking and the legislature needs to be talking. The whole cooperative automated transportation conversation makes broadband even more important. And what we're all seeing today, this meeting, focuses on the importance of broadband accommodation. And as we see more telecommunity and more of this happening as kind of a new normal coming out of the pandemic, we need that infrastructure. And in a lot of places, we don't have it. In a lot of places, we need to work with the private sector to bring that on board. Now, this is being led by the Department of Commerce. They have a broadband office, and their goal is to have everyone, all residences and businesses will have symmetrical 150 megabit per second service by 2028. That's an audacious goal here in the United States. It's kind of embarrassing in the developed world, though, if you compare us to Korea, for example. I'm fortunate that I have service up to a gig here at my house, if nobody else in the neighborhood's using it. But a lot of our employees who have been home teleworking have been limited by their access to broadband or lack thereof. What we're looking at is what can we do in our right-of-way to accommodate the development of the broadband infrastructure that we need to remain competitive. So we have RCW in terms of utility accommodation and wireless leasing and general leasing authority, all of which regulate how we act with the utility companies. And the federal government regulates how we act with the utility companies. For example, today in the interstate right-of-way, no longitudinal utilities. We can issue a permit, and we do, to cross our right-of-way. But a permit to go down our right-of-way, not so much. And so we are exploring, and in fact, I have a big meeting this afternoon with the team, and we're working with Commerce and others on, are we going to need to make changes to the law and to administrative rules to better position Washington to work with the private sector to give the citizens we serve access to the latest and greatest in broadband. So we're evaluating our policies, we're exploring opportunities, we're working with ports and PUDs and working with tribal governments. We're focused on partnership and collaboration rather than traditional permitting and leasing. And we're also looking at, can we put conduit in as just a part of our preservation program to build up the network over time. Roadway striping and marking, another thing we're doing. Whether you're driving an AV or just driving your car yourself, I would like to see a bigger investment in paint on our roads. Given our budget situation, we balance priorities, and paint. The paint you see is the paint we can afford. But higher quality striping is now an operational need, and it will help with the development of and testing of AVs and cooperative automated transportation over time. We're looking at work zone safety. We have some stuff in process right now where our work zones send information out that the private sector can pick up. You can see here where Waze is keeping track of what's happening, and that's better information, makes for a safer transportation system. We have a work zone database that we're developing as we have resources. It's kind of another duties as assigned thing for us, but more and more is happening in this space, and look for more good stuff as we go forward. So in conclusion, here's CAT, the world of CAT, and there are people around the table that know a lot more about it than I do that might add some stuff to this matrix. When you focus on connected and autonomous vehicles, you're right here, and we need to have a broader focus. And we need to do these things. We need to organize, we need to share, we need to keep economic vitality and livability in mind. It's the infrastructure, it's the land use, equity, safety, and the environment. That's my show. I think I'm out of sharing mode. I hope I am. And Mr. Chair, happy to answer any questions that members of the committee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We are over time right now. We're supposed to be on our break. I'm assuming everyone, if somebody has questions for the Secretary, we can go ahead and take those now and take a shorter break, or we can push it longer. I'm kind of want to get some feedback from the members as to how you want to do this. Do you want to take a break now and then come back at noon as planned and then ask the Secretary questions, or do you want to take questions now?
I actually have like 2 questions for the Secretary, but I believe that they're ever so slightly off topic. And so if he doesn't mind sticking around, I could do a personal chat and satisfy that.
Okay, thank you,
Rick. And let the record reflect, I'm late because I started late.
Oh, yes, sir. No, we were late. So it was a good discussion though, and it was an important discussion.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I'm glad to have it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and have us recess for the next 25 minutes or so, and we will be back at noon. We're asking that you stay connected to the meeting and just mute your microphone and disable your video. We will be back at noon.